Hello everyone, and welcome. Before we begin today's story, we have one small request. Please subscribe to our channel and turn on the notification bell so you never miss any of our new videos. It only takes a moment, it's completely free, and it's one of the best ways to support us as we continue creating dramatic, emotional stories like this one. Your support truly means more to us than you know. Before we start, let us know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is in your part of the world. We always love seeing how far our stories reach and discovering who is joining us today. Now, let's begin today's story. The cruelest lies are never the ones spoken out loud. They're the ones we choose to believe before asking for the truth. Damien Ashford's voice was as cold as the rain tapping against the towering windows of Ashford Biotech's executive office when he looked into Julian Mercer's tear-filled eyes and uttered the words that shattered both of their futures. The pregnancy was a trap. The sentence lingered in the room long after it was spoken, heavier than the silence that followed. Julian didn't argue. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't beg Damien to believe him. His trembling fingers instinctively rested against the barely noticeable curve beneath his sweater, protecting the tiny life only he knew was already changing everything. 6 weeks earlier, Julian had believed fate had finally smiled on him. Working as a genetic research specialist at Ashford Biotech had introduced him to Damien, the company's brilliant and intimidating alpha CEO, whose confidence filled every room before he even entered it. Beneath Damien's commanding presence was a quiet loneliness few people ever noticed, and beneath Julian's calm smile was an intelligence that impressed even the most skeptical scientists. Their relationship had grown slowly, built on late nights discussing research, impossible deadlines, and shared dreams neither dared confess aloud. Then, without warning, everything unraveled. Anonymous documents arrived at Damien's office claiming Julian had deliberately manipulated confidential fertility research to become pregnant and secure control over Ashford Biotech's future inheritance. Financial records appeared showing mysterious payments. Fabricated messages painted Julian as part of a calculated scheme. Every piece of evidence fit together so perfectly that questioning it almost seemed impossible. Damien, a man who had spent his entire life surviving betrayals disguised as loyalty, believed what was placed before him. The trust they had carefully built collapsed within minutes. Julian searched Damien's face one final time, hoping to find even the smallest trace of doubt. But all he saw was disappointment hiding behind icy certainty. Quietly, he slipped the silver ring Damien had once given him onto the polished desk. One day, Julian whispered softly, "I hope the truth finds you before regret does." Then he walked away without looking back. Outside, the November wind swept across downtown Chicago as evening lights reflected against rain-soaked streets. Julian climbed into an old rideshare, carrying only a single suitcase, a folder containing his medical records, and a heart too exhausted to break any further. By sunrise, every trace of him had disappeared. His apartment stood empty. His phone number no longer existed. His employee records had been legally transferred under a new identity through a witness protection program funded by someone whose name remained sealed. Even the hospital where his prenatal appointments had been scheduled reported no patient by the name Julian Mercer. He had vanished overnight. Damien believed the disappearance confirmed everything. To him, only a guilty person would run so completely. But miles away, as the city skyline faded behind the car window, Julian gently rested both hands over the tiny heartbeat growing inside him. Looking toward the first rays of dawn stretching across the highway, he made the only promise that still mattered. "No matter what the world believes about me," he whispered, "you will grow up knowing that you were never a trap. You were always my greatest miracle." Julian Mercer drove until the skyline disappeared behind rolling fields and endless highways, stopping only when exhaustion became impossible to ignore. 300 miles from Chicago, he found a quiet town called Maple Grove, a place where strangers were welcomed with polite smiles instead of suspicious questions. The small community rested beside a peaceful lake surrounded by maple trees that painted the streets in brilliant shades of red and gold each autumn. It felt like the kind of place where painful memories struggled to follow. Under the protection of a confidential identity program arranged through an old attorney who had once admired Julian's integrity, he became Ethan Collins, a freelance medical editor working entirely from home. The name changed, but the loneliness remained. Months passed with remarkable silence. Every morning began before sunrise with a gentle walk around the neighborhood, followed by long hours editing scientific journals while quietly preparing for the arrival of his child. The tiny rented house was modest, with weathered wooden floors, a narrow kitchen, and a front porch overlooking a quiet street where children rode bicycles after school. Julian decorated a small bedroom himself, painting soft blue clouds across one wall and carefully assembling a simple crib he found at a local charity store. Every brushstroke became another promise that this child would grow up surrounded by love instead of fear. Meanwhile, Damien Ashford buried himself deeper inside work than ever before. Ashford Biotech announced record profits, groundbreaking research partnerships, and expansion across several states. Yet none of those achievements filled the strange emptiness waiting for him each evening. His executives praised his relentless discipline, but those closest to him noticed subtle changes. He stopped attending charity galas. He rarely smiled during interviews. The office that had once carried the faint scent of Julian's favorite vanilla coffee now felt strangely lifeless. Whenever someone accidentally mentioned Julian's name, an uncomfortable silence followed before business quickly resumed. Damien convinced himself that he had simply survived another betrayal. But late at night his thoughts often drifted toward the final sentence Julian had spoken before leaving. The words refused to disappear, repeating themselves during sleepless hours with quiet persistence. Winter melted into spring, and on a bright April morning, Julian welcomed a healthy baby boy into the world. The first sound of his son's gentle cry erased months of fear in a single heartbeat. Holding the tiny bundle against his chest, Julian felt something stronger than heartbreak replace the emptiness Damien had left behind. He smiled through grateful tears as he whispered the name he had chosen long before the delivery. Oliver Mercer. He intentionally kept his son's original family name, believing that children should never lose part of their identity because of the mistakes adults make. Oliver grew surrounded by bedtime stories, homemade pancakes every Saturday morning, library visits every Wednesday afternoon, and endless reminders that kindness mattered more than pride. Julian never spoke bitterly about Damien. Whenever Oliver innocently asked why other children had fathers attending school events while he did not, Julian simply answered, "Sometimes good people become lost before they find the right road again." Miles away, Damien unknowingly passed another birthday alone inside his quiet penthouse, unaware that a little boy with silver eyes remarkably similar to his own had just learned to laugh every time birds gathered outside the kitchen window. 5 years passed so quietly that even the deepest scars learned how to hide beneath ordinary days. Maple Grove became more than a place on a map. It became home. Every neighbor knew Ethan Collins as the kind medical editor who never forgot birthdays, volunteered at the community library every Saturday morning, and baked blueberry muffins whenever someone new moved into town. No one questioned the gentle father raising a bright little boy on his own because kindness had a way of silencing unnecessary curiosity. Oliver flourished in that warmth. By the age of 5, he had developed an extraordinary memory that amazed everyone around him. He could finish entire picture books after hearing them only twice, remember license plate numbers from family road trips, and point out tiny differences between photographs taken months apart. His kindergarten teacher joked that his brain worked like a camera, but Julian quietly wondered if the remarkable gift had come from Damien. Every evening, father and son ended their day on the front porch, watching fireflies dance across the summer air while sharing stories about bravery, honesty, and compassion. Julian never taught Oliver to hate anyone. Instead, he reminded him that wisdom meant listening before judging because appearances often hid truths that patience eventually uncovered. Hundreds of miles away, Damien Ashford's world looked successful from the outside, but strangely hollow within. His company had become one of the country's leading biotechnology innovators, and business magazines celebrated him as a visionary leader, yet every accomplishment seemed strangely incomplete. During a routine executive meeting, a longtime legal advisor presented an unexpected report about archived security records connected to an internal fraud investigation that had quietly remained unresolved for years. Most executives dismissed it as irrelevant history, but one detail caught Damien's attention. A timestamp from the night anonymous evidence had appeared against Julian did not match the official building access logs. The discrepancy was only 90 seconds, insignificant to everyone else, but impossible to ignore for someone who trusted precision above instinct. Damien requested every archived document from the original investigation, surprising even himself. As boxes filled with forgotten files arrived at his office over the following weeks, small inconsistencies began revealing themselves like stars appearing after sunset. A digital signature carried formatting that had not existed at the time it was supposedly created. A financial transfer originated from an account later proven inactive months before the alleged payment. An internal email contained terminology introduced into company policy nearly a year afterward. Individually, each mistake seemed harmless. Together, they whispered a frightening possibility. Someone had not merely lied. Someone had carefully rewritten reality. Damien found himself staring at Julian's resignation letter preserved inside the personnel archive. The handwriting remained calm, graceful, and painfully sincere. There was no anger, no accusation, only gratitude for opportunities once shared and hope that truth would eventually outlive misunderstanding. For the first time in 5 years, Damien wondered whether the man he had condemned had actually been trying to protect something instead of himself. That single question refused to leave his mind. At the same moment, far away in Maple Grove, Oliver returned home carrying a classroom assignment asking students to draw the people they loved most. Julian smiled as Oliver proudly held up the finished picture. It showed only 2 figures standing beneath a bright blue sky, their hands connected by a single golden line stretching between them. At the very edge of the page, almost hidden beside a large oak tree, Oliver had carefully sketched the outline of a third person facing them from a distance. When Julian gently asked who the stranger was, Oliver looked up with innocent certainty and answered, "I do not know his name yet, but someday he is going to need us more than we need him." The first Saturday in October arrived with crisp morning air and the familiar excitement of Maple Grove's annual Harvest Festival, an event that transformed the quiet town square into a celebration of music, handmade crafts, warm apple cider, and neighbors greeting one another like family. Julian volunteered at the community library booth, while Oliver eagerly helped children choose free books from colorful shelves arranged beneath bright orange banners. Watching his son laugh so freely, Julian allowed himself to believe that the painful chapter he had left behind truly belonged to another lifetime. At almost the same moment, Damien Ashford's private car rolled into Maple Grove for reasons that had nothing to do with fate, at least not from his perspective. Ashford Biotech had recently funded a rural education initiative, and Damien insisted on personally visiting one of the participating libraries after learning that small communities often produced extraordinary young minds overlooked by larger cities. His assistants considered the visit unusual because Damien rarely accepted public appearances outside major business events. Yet something inside him had changed since discovering the inconsistencies hidden within the old investigation. He had begun searching not only through forgotten company records, but also through himself, questioning decisions he had once defended without hesitation. As Damien stepped onto the town square, dressed simply enough to avoid unnecessary attention, he immediately noticed how different Maple Grove felt from Chicago. There was no rush, no constant noise, only children running between pumpkin displays while local musicians filled the air with cheerful melodies. For the first time in years, his shoulders relaxed without him realizing it. Across the square, Oliver spotted a tall man helping an elderly volunteer gather books that had slipped from a folding table after a sudden gust of wind. Without hesitation, the little boy hurried over and began picking them up with careful hands. Damien smiled warmly as he knelt beside him. "Thank you for the rescue," he said. Oliver looked up with striking silver eyes that caused something deep inside Damien to pause. The resemblance felt impossible to explain. There was nothing he could logically identify, yet the child seemed strangely familiar, like a memory waiting just beyond reach. "Books should never stay on the ground," Oliver answered with complete sincerity. "Someone might be waiting for the story inside." Damien laughed softly, surprised by the thoughtful reply. "That is probably the smartest thing anyone has told me all week." Before either of them could say anything more, Julian looked up from the library booth and froze. Time seemed to fold in on itself as his eyes met Damien's across the busy festival. 5 years disappeared in a single heartbeat. His pulse quickened, but he forced himself to remain calm for Oliver's sake. Damien slowly turned toward the direction of the child's gaze. Their eyes met for the first time since the night everything had fallen apart. Neither of them moved. Neither spoke. Around them, laughter, music, and conversation continued as though the world had not shifted. Oliver glanced between the two adults with quiet curiosity, sensing an invisible connection neither of them understood how to explain. Then, with the innocent honesty only a child could possess, he reached for Damien's hand with one small finger while holding Julian's hand with the other and smiled. "It feels like you already know each other," he said. Neither adult answered, but somewhere beneath years of misunderstanding, regret, and carefully guarded silence, the first fragile crack in the wall separating their lives had finally begun to appear. Julian's first instinct was to take Oliver home immediately, to place as much distance as possible between his carefully built life and the man who had once unknowingly destroyed it. Yet when he looked down at his son, he saw only genuine excitement shining in those familiar silver eyes. Oliver was happily asking Damien questions about the books he liked to read, completely unaware of the invisible history standing between the two adults. Julian reminded himself that whatever pain existed belonged to him, not to the child who had done nothing except bring light into the world. Damien noticed Julian's hesitation and spoke with unexpected humility. "I did not come here to interrupt your day," he said quietly. "The library director invited me to see the education program our foundation supports. If my presence makes things uncomfortable, I can leave." The confidence that had once defined every word Damien spoke had softened into something far more restrained. Julian had never imagined hearing uncertainty in his voice. Before Julian could answer, the library director approached with a warm smile and thanked Damien for donating hundreds of new children's books to the community. She then turned toward Julian without realizing the complicated connection between them. "Ethan, would you mind showing Mr. Ashford the new reading room? You know every corner of this place better than anyone." Refusing would only draw attention, so Julian nodded politely and led the way inside. Oliver skipped happily ahead, proudly explaining which shelves contained adventure stories, science books, and his personal favorites about space exploration. Damien listened with sincere interest, asking thoughtful questions that encouraged Oliver to speak even more enthusiastically. Every answer the little boy gave seemed unusually mature for his age. When Damien asked what he wanted to become someday, Oliver smiled without hesitation. "Someone who helps people trust each other again." The answer landed in Damien's heart with surprising force. It sounded less like a childhood dream and more like quiet wisdom earned through experiences no 5-year-old should have understood. As they reached a small reading corner beside a large window overlooking the lake, Oliver climbed onto a chair and pointed toward an old oak tree outside. "My dad says strong trees survive because their roots stay connected even when storms break the branches." Damien looked toward Julian. "That sounds like something worth remembering." Julian answered calmly. "Some lessons only make sense after losing something important." Their conversation remained respectful, but beneath every ordinary sentence lived countless unspoken memories. Damien found himself studying Julian's expression, noticing familiar kindness that time had never erased. There was no bitterness in his eyes, only quiet caution. That realization troubled Damien even more than anger would have. If Julian had truly tried to deceive him years earlier, why did he carry himself with such peaceful dignity now? Before Damien could explore the thought further, Oliver accidentally dropped a small notebook from his backpack. As Damien picked it up, several pages opened to detailed sketches of faces, buildings, and everyday moments, each drawn with astonishing accuracy. One sketch immediately caught his attention. It showed a hospital hallway with remarkable precision, including a nurse standing beside a reception desk and a man wearing a dark baseball cap near an elevator. Damien smiled politely and handed the notebook back, assuming it was imaginary. Oliver hugged it carefully and said, "I draw places so I never forget them. Dad says memories can help people someday." Julian gently placed a hand on Oliver's shoulder, encouraging him toward the next activity, but Damien could not stop thinking about the drawing. Something about the face beneath, The baseball cap stirred a distant memory he could not yet place, leaving him with the unmistakable feeling that the answers he had searched for over the past 5 years might have quietly found their way to Maple Grove long before he ever arrived. Damien returned to Chicago carrying more questions than answers. The image of Oliver's notebook lingered in his thoughts throughout the flight, especially the carefully drawn face beneath the dark baseball cap. It was too precise to be a child's invention. The proportions, the posture, even the slight tilt of the man's shoulders suggested a memory rather than imagination. Early the next morning, Damien unlocked a secure archive that had not been accessed in years and requested every document connected to the investigation that had destroyed his relationship with Julian. This time he was not searching for evidence of guilt. He was searching for the truth. Hours became days as he compared security footage, visitor logs, financial reports, and digital records line by line. The inconsistencies he had discovered earlier multiplied. An electronic signature had been authenticated by software that had not yet been installed. A visitor badge appeared in one database, but not another. A surveillance camera supposedly covering an important hallway had experienced a mysterious maintenance outage lasting exactly 11 minutes on the same evening anonymous evidence surfaced. None of those details had attracted attention before because everyone, including Damien, had accepted the conclusion first and examined the facts afterward. Determined to avoid repeating the same mistake, Damien hired an independent digital forensic specialist with no connection to Ashford Biotech. 3 days later, the specialist delivered an unexpected finding. Several documents had been created from a remote workstation that belonged to a temporary systems consultant whose contract had quietly ended less than a week after Julian disappeared. The consultant had left no forwarding address, no emergency contact, and no professional references that could be verified. It was as though the individual had intentionally stepped into the company long enough to leave behind invisible fingerprints before disappearing completely. Damien leaned back in his chair, feeling the weight of regret settle more heavily than ever before. If someone had engineered the deception so carefully, then Julian had been standing alone against a lie too sophisticated to defend himself from. Meanwhile, life in Maple Grove continued with comforting simplicity. Julian spent his mornings editing medical journals while Oliver attended kindergarten, always returning home with another curious observation about the world. One rainy afternoon, Oliver opened his sketchbook at the kitchen table and began drawing the hospital hallway again, adding details he had forgotten before. Julian watched quietly until Oliver pointed to the man wearing the baseball cap. "He was looking at everyone except me," Oliver said thoughtfully. "That is why I remembered him. Dad always says people who avoid looking at others are usually hiding something." Julian paused, surprised. "Do you remember seeing him anywhere else?" Oliver nodded slowly. "He talked to a lady carrying a folder with your name on it." Then she looked scared. Julian's heartbeat quickened. The memory had happened years ago, during one of his prenatal appointments. Yet Oliver described it with remarkable clarity despite having only been an infant carried in his father's arms. Julian knew extraordinary memory sometimes appeared in children, but this level of detail felt almost unbelievable. That evening, after Oliver fell asleep, Julian opened a sealed storage box he had not touched since leaving Chicago. Inside rested hospital appointment cards, old identification badges, and a folded visitor receipt from the clinic. Written across the corner in faded ink was a timestamp that matched the date Oliver had unknowingly drawn. For the first time in 5 years, Julian realized that the past had quietly preserved pieces of the truth, waiting patiently for someone willing to look beyond assumptions and finally place them together. Julian spent the next several days carefully organizing every document he had preserved without ever expecting to use again. Medical appointment cards, appointment reminders, visitor receipts, and handwritten notes were arranged across his dining table in chronological order. None of them proved his innocence by themselves, yet together they formed a timeline that no longer matched the story Damien had believed for years. Before deciding what to do, Julian focused on the responsibility that mattered most. Every afternoon after school, he and Oliver continued their familiar routine of walking around Maple Grove Lake, feeding ducks, and talking about whatever curious question happened to be on Oliver's mind that day. One evening, Oliver suddenly stopped beside a wooden bridge and looked thoughtfully at the reflection shimmering across the water. "Dad," he asked quietly, "can people remember something even if everyone else forgets it?" Julian smiled gently. "Sometimes they can. Truth has a patient way of waiting until someone is ready to see it." Oliver nodded as though the answer confirmed something he had already been thinking about. The following weekend, the town library hosted a children's art exhibition featuring drawings created throughout the school year. Parents wandered between colorful displays, while local volunteers admired the imagination filling every page. Damien happened to return to Maple Grove that same afternoon after asking the library director whether he could quietly donate additional educational materials without attracting media attention. As he walked through the exhibit, one particular drawing immediately caught his attention. It showed the same hospital hallway Oliver had drawn before, but this version contained even more remarkable details. Beside the man in the baseball cap stood a woman carrying a blue folder marked with a small silver emblem. Damien stared at the symbol in disbelief. It belonged to a discontinued subcontractor that had briefly handled secure document transfers for Ashford Biotech during the exact year everything had fallen apart. The company had dissolved shortly afterward, and most employees had scattered across the country. Damien took a slow breath, resisting the urge to jump to conclusions again. Instead, he quietly photographed the drawing with permission from the exhibition coordinator and returned to Chicago determined to verify every detail before speaking to Julian. Within 48 hours, independent investigators located archived employment records connected to the subcontractor. Among them appeared the name of the temporary systems consultant whose digital activity had already raised suspicion. Both individuals had worked on the same project during the same month. More importantly, financial audits revealed they had both received consulting payments routed through a private investment firm that had attempted to acquire confidential biotechnology research from several competing companies before disappearing under a different corporate name. The deception had never been about Julian alone. It had been part of a calculated effort to manipulate sensitive research by destroying the trust between the people closest to it. Damien closed the final report with trembling hands as every painful memory returned in a completely different light. At that same moment in Maple Grove, Oliver sat beside Julian coloring autumn leaves when he suddenly looked toward the front window. "Dad," he said softly, "the sad man is coming back." Julian glanced outside and saw no one there. Only leaves drifting across the quiet street beneath the golden afternoon sun. Yet somewhere far beyond the peaceful town, Damien had already begun the journey that would finally allow truth, regret, and hope to meet at the same destination. Damien arrived in Maple Grove before sunrise carrying no legal documents, no security team, and no expectations that forgiveness could be earned with explanations alone. He parked several blocks away from Julian's house and spent nearly an hour sitting quietly inside his car, watching the first light of morning spread across the peaceful neighborhood. For the first time in years, success, wealth, and reputation meant nothing. There was only one conversation that mattered, and he knew he had no right to demand it. When Julian opened his front door to leave for the library, he immediately recognized Damien standing beside the sidewalk with both hands visible and an expression unlike any he had ever seen before. The proud alpha who had once believed certainty was strength now looked like a man carrying the weight of every unanswered question he had ignored. Julian remained silent, allowing Damien to speak first. "I know I cannot ask you to trust me," Damien said quietly. "I only came because I finally learned that you never betrayed me." Julian studied his face without anger. "You learned the truth," he answered calmly. "That is different from believing me." The words settled between them with painful honesty. Damien lowered his eyes. "You are right. I believed evidence before I believed the person standing in front of me. I cannot change what I did." Before either man continued, Oliver stepped onto the porch carrying his favorite storybook. His face brightened with surprise when he recognized Damien. "You came back," he said with an excited smile. Damien knelt to Oliver's eye level. "I promised the library I would bring more books, and I hoped I might see my smartest reading partner again." Oliver laughed softly before reaching for Damien's hand with the natural trust children often offered so freely. Julian watched the moment in thoughtful silence. There was no fear in Oliver's expression, only genuine comfort that seemed to exist beyond logic. Later that afternoon, The three of them walked through Maple Grove Park after Oliver insisted they all feed the ducks together. Conversation remained simple. Oliver talked about school, favorite constellations, and the science fair he hoped to enter the following spring. Damien listened carefully to every word, discovering pieces of himself reflected in the little boy's curiosity, patience, and quiet determination. When Oliver ran ahead to count turtles resting on a fallen log, Damien finally looked toward Julian again. "The investigation is finished," he said softly. "Every report confirms the evidence was fabricated by people trying to gain access to confidential research. You were never the target. You were the obstacle standing between them and what they wanted." Julian took a slow breath. "I stopped asking why years ago. My only goal became giving Oliver a peaceful life." Damien hesitated before asking the question that had lived inside him since the harvest. "Festival. Does he know who I am?" Julian followed Oliver with his eyes before answering. "He knows there is someone I once loved very deeply. I never taught him resentment because I refused to let my pain become his inheritance." Damien closed his eyes for a brief moment as regret tightened inside his chest. No accusation Julian could have spoken would have hurt more than the kindness he had chosen instead. As the afternoon sun reflected across the quiet lake, Oliver suddenly turned around and waved both of them closer. "Come look," he called happily. The turtles finally climbed onto the same log. Damien and Julian stood side by side watching the peaceful scene, neither noticing that, for the first time in many years, they had taken the same step forward without either of them stepping away. Several weeks later, Ashford Biotech held a special meeting unlike any in its history. Instead of announcing a new product or celebrating another financial milestone, Damien stood before the board of directors, senior researchers, employees, and invited partners with a single purpose that could no longer be postponed. Every independent investigation had reached the same conclusion. The evidence used years earlier against Julian had been deliberately fabricated through a coordinated scheme designed to manipulate confidential research by destroying trust inside the company. The official report cleared Julian completely, and Damien insisted that every finding be released without omission or revision. Then, before anyone expected another word, he stepped away from the podium and spoke not as the powerful alpha who had built a global company, but simply as a man who had finally learned the cost of believing fear instead of love. "The greatest mistake of my life was not being deceived," he said quietly. "It was doubting the person who deserved my trust the most." The room remained silent as his words settled over everyone present. Damien formally restored Julian's professional reputation, established a research scholarship in his honor for young scientists committed to ethical innovation, and announced that every future internal investigation would require independent verification before any conclusion could be accepted. Reputation, he declared, should never again be destroyed by assumptions disguised as certainty. A few days later, Damien returned to Maple Grove, not with contracts or promises, but with patience. He accepted that healing could not be rushed, and that forgiveness was a gift, never an obligation. Over time, he became a familiar presence in Oliver's life. They built model rockets together on quiet weekends, planted vegetables in the small backyard garden, and spent rainy afternoons reading adventure novels at the library where they had first met. Damien never tried to replace the years he had lost by pretending they had never happened. Instead, he earned each new memory one ordinary day at a time. Julian watched carefully, allowing actions to speak louder than apologies. The man standing beside Oliver now was no longer driven by pride or certainty. He listened before speaking, admitted mistakes without excuses, and treated every shared moment as something precious rather than guaranteed. One evening, as autumn leaves drifted gently across Maple Grove Lake, Oliver sat between the two adults on the old wooden dock, quietly skipping smooth stones across the water. After counting the final ripple, he looked up with the thoughtful expression that always reminded Julian how extraordinary his son truly was. "Do you know why the turtles climbed onto the same log?" he asked. Damien smiled. "Why?" Oliver shrugged with innocent confidence. "Because staying apart did not make the river any warmer." Julian laughed softly, and after a long moment, so did Damien. The sound carried across the quiet lake with a peace neither of them had believed possible years earlier. As the sun disappeared beyond the trees, Julian reached for Damien's hand, not because the past had been erased, but because the future no longer needed to be held hostage by it. Their story was never about perfection. It was about choosing truth over assumption, compassion over pride, and courage over fear. Oliver leaned comfortably against both of them, watching the first evening stars appear above the calm water. In that simple moment, surrounded by honesty, forgiveness, and the family they had rebuilt together, all three finally understood that love becomes strongest not when it never breaks, but when it finds the wisdom to heal.